Hey folks, this is Joe with Palmetto Land Buyers and PalmettoHouseBuyers.com. And today I wanted to go through one of the articles we recently wrote here on the website. And it is Unlocking Home Ownership, Exploring Rent-to-Own Opportunities in Columbia, South Carolina. Now, I want to talk about the article, about this blog post, and I want to talk primarily about rent-to-own, right? Not so much Columbia, South Carolina, or any particular town or city in South Carolina. I just want to talk about rent-to-own and what that might look like here in South Carolina. So a more generalized review of the concept of rent to own versus looking at it primarily in Columbia. The reason is that I don't know it's going to differ so much between Columbia and Greenville, right? A rent to own in Columbia or a rent to own opportunity in Greenville, South Carolina, or even Charleston for that matter. So this is the blog here, and we'll go ahead and we'll scroll a little bit down. Because we started off just discussing why it's a good time right now to sell in Columbia and some of the benefits of selling today in Columbia, South Carolina. But we'll get right here. So the appeal of the rent-to-own model. Okay, so the rent-to-own model offers unique advantages to both the buyers and the sellers, and it's true. For sellers, it provides a steady stream of income while allowing potential buyers to gradually transition into home ownership. This model is particularly appealing to buyers who may not qualify for traditional mortgages but are committed to owning a home. Yeah, look, rent to own does have advantages for both the buyer and the seller. In my opinion, I think the biggest advantage is to the buyer, because if you're a buyer, it gives you the opportunity to test out the home, which is a big deal. Because think about how many times does a buyer really get to test out the house that they're fixing to buy? It's like taking it for a prolonged test drive. Imagine if the car dealership said, you know what, go ahead, take this car for a month, right? Try it out, pay me rent, pay me a lease, $300 a month or whatever. And if you decide you like it, then you can go ahead and buy it, right? That'd be pretty crazy. That'd be a pretty cool experience. And that's basically what you get to do with a rent to own. The owner's saying, look, go ahead, live in the house, pay me rent, okay? Pay me rent, live in the house. And if you decide to buy it within this specified period, and the specified period could be 6 months, could be a year, you can exercise your option to purchase the property. And then you buy that house if you like it. But, you might move in, and 3 months into living in the house, you realize, hey, this house sucks. This is actually a crappy house. I don't like it, right? And then you can back out of, stay there for the remainder of the lease, but you have no obligation to buy. And for the seller, it gives you the opportunity of finding a larger pool of potential buyers. Okay? Not every buyer qualifies for a conventional loan or for an FHA loan or a VA loan. It's hard for a lot of folks to secure a mortgage, especially nowadays, because interest rates are so high. So if you're offering rent to own, you've really opened it up now to this population of people that typically wouldn't even have looked at the property if it was up for sale, because they don't have access to traditional financing. A mortgage, for example, from Bank of America or from some other major institution. So giving them the opportunity to put in maybe a down payment and having those rental payments go towards the purchase price, it really does afford people an opportunity to experience what it's like to own a house. Because it's owning a house and renting a house is it's very different. There's a lot of responsibility that comes with owning, and it's not for everyone. And I think that's why you find certain groups of people who prefer to be renters, because then they don't have to worry about any of the upkeep. I, right, honestly, me, I'd prefer to rent. I'd prefer to rent an apartment where I don't have to worry about anything. The HOA handles the landscaping, the painting. I want the apartment and the community and the community areas and the elevator to look clean and be functional. And I just want a place where I can have my stuff and not have to worry about cutting grass or fixing the toilet or fixing the plumbing, because it's a hassle. It definitely is a pain in the butt to have to deal with that stuff. All right, but let's continue. All right, so rent to own, a win-win solution. So how does rent to own works? And look, with all these deals, I just want to preface by saying that we outlined a certain way that it works, but I'll share some other examples of how you can structure a rent to own deal. All right. In a rent to own agreement, the seller leases the property to the buyer with an option to purchase at a later date. A portion of the monthly rent is typically credited, towards the future purchase price. This arrangement benefits both parties. The buyer gets time to improve their credit and save for a down payment, while the seller enjoys rental income and a potential sale. Now, in this model here that we portrayed, the seller is leasing the property to the buyer, which is true always. You are always leasing the property to the buyer. However, the monthly rent doesn't necessarily need to go towards the purchase price. Okay, it could just be the rent you pay. But the neat thing about the rent to own is that you can establish the purchase price up front. So you might say, look, the rent is $1,000 a month, right? And you'd make those, you'd specify those details in the lease agreement, but the purchase price will be $100,000. Okay, if you could do a down payment of $2,000, which will apply to the purchase price, bringing it down to $98,000, but the monthly payments are strictly rental payments, and they are not applied to the purchase price. Okay, that would be more of a type of deal that I would probably like. Although the other one isn't bad either. One key thing to note, and it's this terminology here: option to purchase. So the buyer is afforded the option to purchase, and an option is the right but not the obligation. Okay, so what does that mean? The buyer has the right to purchase but not the obligation. The seller has the obligation to sell. So if you get into a rent to own agreement for the specified time, and that's stated on that rent to own agreement, let's say it's a year, so January 1st to December 31st. At any time between January 1st and December 31st of that year, the buyer can exercise their right to purchase the property, and you as a seller would be obligated to sell the property to them. No questions asked. You cannot sell the property to anybody else without consent of the seller or without consent of the buyer, if it's stated in the purchase agreement that way. But typically, you cannot sell it to anybody else. The buyer has secured the option for that year. Here's another thing. Let's say January 1st, you decide you're going to sell the property for $100,000. And so you award that option or that rent-to-own agreement with a purchase price of $100,000 to the buyer. Well, come October, let's say real estate values, for whatever reason, right, some sort of a miracle, real estate values skyrocket in that area. The buyer may choose to exercise their right to buy at the January price. So when they buy it, regardless of what market values are today or the day of, they execute that option at the January price of $100,000. So if real estate values shoot up to $200,000, you still have to sell it at $100,000. Okay? So that can be a little bit risky for the seller. Let's say the inverse, right? Let's say you get it for 100, you and the buyer, the seller and the buyer set up the contract for a purchase price of $100,000 in January, and come October, there's some issue that drives prices down, and now the real estate has a fair market value of $50,000. The buyer, because they have an option, and that option states that they have the right to buy and not the obligation, they don't need to exercise that option contract. Okay? So that's also something to think about and to consider. All right, so let's continue then. Attracting a broader pool of buyers. And I alluded to this earlier. Okay, so the rent-to-own model opens the door to a wider range of potential buyers. It appeals to individuals who may not qualify for a mortgage immediately, but have the financial stability to make regular payments. This includes young professionals, self-employed individuals, and those with minor credit issues. Okay. And that is probably the major appeal to a seller is, look, the amount of rent-to-own options are significantly less than regular traditional for sale options. Okay. Seller financing issues or seller financing opportunities are probably a bit more plentiful than rent-to-own. And so, with rent-to-own, because they're rare and because people are actively looking for it, because there are thousands and thousands of people, right? If we're talking about South Carolina, probably a million people, millions of people who don't have great credit or have credit issues and can't secure that financing. So there is demand for this type of investment, right? Rent to own. And so as a seller, you can actually charge a little bit higher on the purchase price. Okay. You can probably ask for a higher down payment. Okay. And collect that money up front. And it's because these rent to own opportunities are far and few. There's not a lot of them. You can go on Zillow, you can go on Facebook and look for these, but you're not going to have a lot of success. You may find 1, 2, maybe 3 in the area that you're interested in, but they're not so numerous that you're going to be inundated with options, right? Now, if you had cash and you were buying a house cash, well, then you've got a ton of options, right? Everything's an option at that point. All right, so let's continue. Maximizing returns with rent-to-own. So by offering a rent-to-own option, sellers can often command a premium on the purchase price. Buyers are willing to pay a higher price for the flexibility and the opportunity to secure their dream home. Additionally, sellers benefit from a steady income stream during the lease period, reducing the financial risk associated with vacant property. Okay. And I hit on that. You definitely can because the rent to own option is an attractive option to buyers, particularly those with credit issues. They're willing to pay a premium because it's rare. It's a rare opportunity. Building trust and security, rent-to-own agreements provide a level of security for sellers. Buyers who enter into these agreements are typically committed to purchasing the property. This reduces the likelihood of the property sitting on the market for an extended period. Moreover, the seller retains ownership until the buyer exercises the purchase option, ensuring control over the property. Okay. I hear just some tips and some stories that we've shared about folks that we know who have had success with a seller with rent to own. But what I want to do, instead of continuing with the blog, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to try and look for a standard rent to own agreement, and I think it'd be interesting for us as a group now to go through it so we can better understand it. So I'm doing a Google search here, standard. Here, let me bring this on screen. Standard rent to own agreement. And okay, we'll click here, allow. And we'll go down to, these are all sponsored, e-sign, rent to own lease option. Let's see if we can get a good view of this here. Sometimes they don't allow you to get a good view of it. Okay. So this one does. Okay. So we can, let me see if we can get a good glimpse of this here. Kind of looks crappy. Okay. I think that's decent right there. Let's see. Can we scroll up and down this thing? No. Jesus Christ, bro. Making it difficult. Not good. All right. Let's go somewhere else. Nope. Okay, here we go. All right, lease to purchase option agreement. All right, so the top is just parties, right? Seller / landlord, buyer / tenant. Again, just more generic information about the property. And here's really where we start to get into the meat and potatoes of the thing. This is where all the obligations of both the seller and the buyer, they're gonna come in after here, right? So rent. So the tenant shall pay the landlord an annual rent. Okay, so she'll pay an annual rent of $1,000 during the said term in monthly payments of. All right. Okay. Yeah. So I had to step away for a second, but I am back. Okay. So the rent. Okay. So the tenant shall pay the landlord the annual rent of $1,000 during said term and monthly payments. Okay. No. Okay. The annual rent. So if it's $1,000 a month, it'd be an annual rent of $12,000. Paid $1,000, right? Payable monthly on the first day of each month in advance at such place as okay. The tenant shall pay a security deposit of, typically it's either 1 month plus last month, or just first month's rent or last month's rent plus a security deposit. So $1,000, $2,000, $3,000 to be returned upon termination of the lease and the payment of all rents due and performance of all other obligations. So far, this is standard rental lease agreement, right? They all kind of read this way. A tenant shall, at its own expense, provide the following utilities, right? So the tenant needs to pay for their electricity, their water, whatever, unless otherwise specified. And right, and if the landlord's paying anything, they'd put it there. Okay, so far, look, this lease option to purchase is exactly reading like a lease agreement. Okay, so let's continue here. Number 3. Tenant further agrees that condition of the premise upon the expiration of this lease, it shall return possession of the lease premises in its present condition. Okay, assignment and subletting. Tenant shall not assign or sublet said premise or allow any other person to occupy the lease premise without the landlord's prior written consent. Now, what assignment or subletting is, they're different. If you, let's say you sign this agreement, and if you're allowed to assign the agreement, that means that if you had a cousin who wanted to buy the property, or you had a friend who was interested, then you can assign the contract to that other person and they take your place. Okay, that's what assignment is. You're basically assigning your place in the contract to someone else. And subletting is, let's say the house has let's say the house is, a 3-bedroom, 2-bathroom house, and the garage was converted and made into like a little apartment room because they had a mother-in-law that was living with them, and so they converted the garage into that space. Subletting would be renting out that space to another person, right? Or not even that, right? You could say you could get it for rent $1,000 a month and say, I could actually rent this place for $1,500 a month, and then you never stay there and you just rent out the rental to somebody else. That would be subletting. Alterations. Tenant shall not make any material structural alterations to the premise. Compliance with the law. Okay. Tenant conduct. Pets. Tenant shall not allow pets on the premise. Or, you could scratch this out and you could allow pets and just charge a fee. Right of termination and reentry in the event of any breach of the payment of rent or any of the allowed charges or other breaches. Okay, so that's just saying, look, if you don't pay the rent, if you have pets in the house, right, and the lease says you can't, then they can terminate that. They can terminate the agreement at any time. Okay. All right. Option terms. So now this is where everything from now, from 4. All right, yeah. So far, everything we've covered on this contract has been just regular, standard lease type of a lease, like a rental agreement. But now with number 4, now we've got we've got something here that's completely different. You wouldn't typically see this on a lease. And that is this option term. So the option to purchase period commences on, right, month, day, and year, and expires at 11:59 of the month, day, and year. Okay. Notice required to exercise the option. To exercise the option to purchase, the buyer tenant must deliver to the seller written notice of the intent to purchase. In addition, the written notice must specify a valid closing date. The closing date must occur before the original expiration date of the lease agreement, or the date of the expiration of the option to purchase agreement designated in paragraph 1, whichever occurs later. Okay, so this here is saying, okay, you've got to exercise the option, you got to notify the seller / landlord that you intend to purchase the property. Okay. And then that notice must specify a valid closing date. Now, what's a valid closing date? Well, according to this paragraph here, a valid closing date needs to be a date before the expiration of either the lease agreement or the option to purchase. Okay, so you could have an option here, let's look at it like this. You could say, all right, let's do the lease agreement. And the lease agreement is going to be from you could say that the lease agreement is from January 1st to December 31st, okay? Let's just say that it's a 12-month lease. But the option to purchase starts January 1st and expires July, in the middle of the year. You could say that, right? So a valid closing date would need to occur either before, in that example, the closing would have to occur before the expiration of the option to purchase. Or maybe it doesn't. Because I'm reading this now, the closing date must occur. So let's say in this scenario, you've got an annual lease, but an option to purchase is only 6 months. If you send notice on your intent to purchase, and you put the closing date to be in November, even though the option to purchase agreement expired in July, as long as you exercise, or as long as you send that intent before the ending of the option to purchase with a closing date in November, then you could still purchase the property. Okay, interesting. Okay. All right, option consideration. As consideration for this option to purchase agreement, the buyer/tenant shall pay the seller/landlord a non-refundable fee of $1,000, $2,000, $10,000. You can dictate the amount here, right? It could be a percentage of the purchase price, whatever the case may be. But let's read further. This amount shall be credited to the purchase price at closing if the buyer/tenant timely exercises the option to purchase, provided that the buyer/tenant is not in default of the lease agreement and B, closes the conveyance of the property. The seller/landlord shall not refund the fee if the buyer defaults in the lease agreement, fails to close the conveyance, or otherwise does not exercise the option. So it's non-refundable. All right, that's basically the option consideration is non-refundable. If you pay $5,000, all right, that $5,000, you're not getting it back. It's either going to be applied to the purchase price once you execute the option, or the seller's going to keep it. Okay? So the option to, this option it's valuable because it gives you the right and not the obligation to buy. You basically are paying for that right. And that payment is shown as this option consideration. Okay. Okay, purchase price. So the purchase price of the property is $100,000, provided that the buyer timely executes the option to purchase. Okay, so that's okay. So let's read here. So okay, so closes. The seller shall credit towards the purchase at closing the sum of from each monthly lease payment. Okay, so you can do, so let's say your monthly rental payment, your lease payment's $1,000. If the seller could say, look, I'm going to apply $100 towards the purchase price to kind of help reduce that, or I'm going to apply the $1,000 right towards the purchase price, or they could say $0, right? None of your monthly payments go towards the purchase price. So you can negotiate on this, right? If you're the buyer, you can say, look, I want, you know, 50% of my purchase of my monthly payments to go towards the purchase price. And, the seller could say, absolutely not, 0%. And then you can come back and say, well, how about 25%, right? And you can negotiate this type of arrangement. Exclusivity of option. So this option to purchase agreement is exclusive and non-assignable and exists solely for the benefit of the named parties above. The buyer's attempt to assign, convey, delegate, or transfer this option to purchase without the seller's express written permission, any such attempt shall be deemed null and void. So again, you cannot assign the responsibilities in this agreement to a third party. Closing and settlement. So seller/landlord shall determine the title company at which settlement shall occur and shall inform the buyer of this location in writing. Buyer agrees that closing costs in their entirety, including any points, fees, and other charges required by the third-party lender, shall be the sole responsibility of the buyer. The only expense related to closing costs apportioned to the seller shall be the prorated share of the ad valorem taxes due at the time of closing, for which the seller landlord is solely responsible. So financing availability. Financing disclaimer, commissions, no real estate commissions or any other commission shall be paid in connection with this transaction. Recording of the agreement. The buyer tenant shall not record this option to purchase agreement on the public records of any public office without the express written consent of the seller/landlord. Okay, so look, this agreement here is pretty straightforward. It's got two distinct parts. The first part is very much a standard lease. The second part is somewhat similar to a purchase agreement, but distinctly different. It has elements of a purchase agreement, but it is very much different because you're talking about non-refundable consideration for the option. You're talking about option periods. So it's different. This is just one example of a lease to purchase option agreement. Most will probably read similar to this. However, some might be more flexible in that they give you options to change more of the wording that's in the contract. So, for example, the closing and settlement. Maybe the seller wants to pay your closing costs, right? The way that this paragraph reads, it's the buyer is paying all their closing costs. Maybe the seller wants to pay it. So, you could change this up. Maybe the seller wants to let you assign the contract, right? This agreement here doesn't allow you to assign it. So they could be different. This contract can be different. This is just an example, but it's a good template. It's something good to start off if you're unfamiliar, to read this and really thoroughly understand it if you're a seller, and especially if you're a buyer. Here's what I'll say. If you're a buyer, you definitely in most cases the seller's going to have the upper hand. The reason being is that rent to own isn't common, but there's a lot of people that want a rent to own deal, and the seller's going to know that, because they're going to get bombarded with messages. So it's definitely, this type of agreement is definitely harder for a buyer to negotiate. The seller has almost all the leverage here, and they can dictate a lot of this. Now, unless you're working with a complete asshole. Most sellers will work with you, within reason, but because there's so much demand for a lease to purchase option agreement, they're not gonna give in a lot. They're not going to um they're not going to give into a lot of what you want as a buyer. So just go in understanding that the seller holds all the cards in these type of agreements. They're going to have a lot of options because there's going to be a lot of buyers that want to get into it. So if you're a buyer and you've got to negotiate these deals, tread lightly. Don't go crazy requesting for a lot of things that the seller, maybe is unwilling to provide. I would just say don't push your luck because there are going to be a lot of people looking to get in on one of these deals. This is one of those deals where if you're a buyer and you're actually sitting down writing writing this option agreement, you're the lucky one because a lot of people are looking out for these type of deals. Look, folks, I hope you found this beneficial. This lease purchase option is rare. It's a rare opportunity. I hope you find some deals out there that you find a deal and you can find the house that you want. I typically don't do lease purchase options agreements. I'm more of a seller financing guy, and that's kind of what I've done. Because if a house is in good enough condition to rent, by my standard, then I want it as a rental. I don't necessarily want to sell it. I want to generate the monthly income from it. But when it comes to like a seller financing, you're selling it outright from the day one. The buyer is the owner, and they got to keep up with the maintenance and everything else that comes with that. So, guys, look, I hope you found this beneficial. If you've got any questions, if you've got real estate that you want to sell, if you've got a lease purchase option and you're looking for a buyer, I'd love to take a look at it. And give me a call. Again, my name's Joe. My number is 803-201-9137. And you can go to our website, palmettolandbuyers.com or palmettohousebuyers.com to get more info. Thank you so much and take care.